It was supposed to be a peaceful evening, just like any other. A family, gathering in their own home, feeling safe, content, and at ease. But that night, everything changed. What began as a routine evening quickly spiraled into a shocking incident that would leave everyone stunned, and for one family, it would mark the beginning of a nightmare they could never have expected. Imagine the horror of going about your business, just living your life, only to be suddenly confronted with accusations that seemed completely unfounded, even malicious. That's exactly what happened when a neighbor, someone they barely knew, decided to take matters into their own hands. The call to the police came quickly, without hesitation, a decision that would spark a series of events no one could have predicted. What happened next was unbelievable, a twist that would change everything for this family in an instant. It all started with a simple misunderstanding, or was it? The neighbor had lived just down the street for years, always keeping to themselves, but there had been tension simmering beneath the surface for a while. That evening, a seemingly harmless exchange turned into something far darker. No one could have imagined that a casual moment would escalate to the point where the police would be called, especially over something so trivial, so petty. But the neighbor, with their phone in hand, dialed the number. They didn't know it yet, but the consequences of that call would ripple through the lives of everyone involved. The police arrived within minutes, lights flashing, sirens blaring, their presence adding fuel to a fire that had barely begun. The family stood there, confused, anxious, unsure of what had just unfolded. What could have possibly gone wrong? They hadn't done anything out of the ordinary. There were no signs of trouble, no visible reason for such an extreme reaction. But the tension in the air was undeniable. The officer stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning the scene, his body language stiff, unsure. Was he about to be part of a routine call, or was there more to this story than anyone realized? As the minutes ticked by, the family found themselves caught in a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and frustration. The accusations began to pile up, each one more outlandish than the last. What had they done to deserve this? Why was this happening to them? The police, seemingly just as bewildered, struggled to make sense of the situation. On the one hand, they were bound by protocol, by the need to investigate any call seriously, but on the other hand, something felt off, something about this whole scene didn't add up. Yet, they continued, asking questions, trying to piece together the story. The neighbor's call had set everything in motion, and now the family was caught in the middle of a drama they didn't even know existed. With every passing moment, the tension mounted, growing thicker in the air like a storm ready to break. Was this just a case of a misunderstanding, or was there something more sinister at play? The police were on edge, unsure how to handle the situation. Were they about to find themselves caught up in something far bigger than anyone could have imagined? The family's world was unraveling in front of them, and the questions kept piling up. What happened next, though, was something no one could have predicted. As the night unfolded, more details began to emerge, shocking revelations that would change everything. The twist that came just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse turned everything on its head, and the ending of this story would leave everyone reeling, wondering how it all happened. The mystery behind the neighbor's call, the real reason it all escalated, and the unimaginable twist that followed were things no one could have expected. But that's where the story ends for now. How did the family handle the escalating tension? What happened when the real truth started to come to light? And most importantly, what was the unbelievable twist that no one saw coming? The answers, as you'll soon see, are more surprising than you could ever have imagined. Stay tuned to find out how everything unfolded in ways that no one could have predicted. The ending will leave you speechless. Just wait. As the evening wore on, the tension between the family and the officers continued to grow. It wasn't just the confusion of the situation that made the air heavy, it was the stark realization that something wasn't right. Nothing made sense. The neighbor's phone call had seemed so trivial at first, but now, with the police arriving, there was no denying that something more was at play. The family, bewildered and shaken, tried to piece together what had gone wrong. They had no idea why the neighbor would make such a call, or why the police seemed so on edge. The officer's gaze kept darting back and forth between the family and the house, his eyes narrowing as if searching for something that wasn't there. The situation felt surreal. The family had lived in this neighborhood for years, never once running into trouble. They were a quiet, peaceful family who kept to themselves, just like most of the others on the block. The house had always been a place of refuge, a place where they could escape the pressures of the outside world. Now, it felt like the walls were closing in. What had set this neighbor off? And why hadn't anyone warned them that something like this could happen? The family, caught off guard by the unexpected confrontation, was left in a state of disbelief. This wasn't the first time they'd interacted with the neighbor, but it was certainly the most intense. They had exchanged pleasantries over the years, a wave here and there, a nod of acknowledgement during chance encounters. But that night, something had changed. The neighbor, who had never given any hint of animosity before, seemed determined to make a scene. It felt like they were looking for a reason to escalate things. But why? The officer, still processing the situation, stood there for a moment longer, weighing his next move. The family was clearly rattled, but what about the neighbor? Was their version of events true? The officer had his doubts, but his job was to investigate, not to make assumptions. As much as he felt something was off, he had to follow procedure, which meant questioning the family thoroughly. "Can you tell me what happened here?" the officer asked, his voice calm but firm. The family hesitated. They didn't know how to answer. The entire situation felt wrong, but they couldn't put it into words. "We didn't do anything," one of them said, their voice trembling slightly. "We were just home, like any other night." The officer nodded, jotting something down in his notepad. "Do you have any idea why your neighbor would make this call?" The family exchanged glances, the silence growing heavier by the second. It was hard to explain something when you didn't even understand it yourself. The officer didn't press any further, but the tension between the two sides was undeniable. The family was on edge, their every movement under scrutiny. It was as if every word they said could somehow be twisted, every action interpreted in a way that made them look guilty, even when they knew they had done nothing wrong. Back at the neighbor's house, the door had been left slightly ajar, a faint light flickering through the windows. The officer's glance shifted in that direction, his eyes narrowing. There was something about the way the door stood, so innocently ajar, yet seemingly hiding something beneath its cracked opening. The officer couldn't shake the feeling that the story being told didn't add up. But what exactly was missing? What had been left unsaid? Despite the family's confusion and shock, there was still no clarity about what had sparked this whole situation. The police, bound by duty and protocol, continued to question them, hoping that somehow, something would break the tension and bring the truth to light. But every answer the family gave only seemed to deepen the mystery. Their confusion was real, and yet the police officer couldn't shake the suspicion that there was more to the story than what they were saying. Meanwhile, inside the neighbor's home, things were far from calm. The door that had been slightly open now swung fully wide, and the neighbor stood there in the doorway, staring out toward the family's house. It was hard to make out their expression, but their body language spoke volumes. They didn't seem like someone who was simply concerned. There was a certain intensity to their stance, something almost predatory. The officer could feel the unease settle deeper into his gut. What exactly had they been expecting to happen here? Were they looking for trouble, or was there something they thought they'd witnessed that just didn't sit right with them? The officer made his way toward the neighbor's house, the situation becoming more and more complicated with each passing second. He couldn't afford to ignore the growing suspicion in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't just a routine call. Something about it felt personal, like there was a deeper conflict hidden beneath the surface, waiting to come to light. As the officer knocked on the door, The neighbor's expression changed. There was no longer any doubt in their eyes. They weren't simply talking to the police out of concern for what they'd witnessed, they were looking for something. They were waiting for the officer to validate their perspective, to make sure they were seen, heard, and believed. The officer couldn't shake the feeling that the whole thing had been set in motion long before that call had been made. With each question, the story the neighbor told became more elaborate, but also more confusing. They spoke of things that didn't quite add up, incidents that seemed to have been twisted into something darker. The officer's brow furrowed as they recounted what they had seen, but there was a certain sense of exaggeration to their words. It wasn't just the details, they seemed to be painting a picture of something much worse than what had actually happened. Back at the family's house, they stood in stunned silence as they listened to the officer's footsteps retreat. What had they been accused of? What had been twisted and distorted? The night was still, but the air was thick with anticipation. The mystery of the call, of the accusations, seemed to loom over them like a dark cloud, threatening to engulf everything in its path. They couldn't make sense of it, but the feeling of something sinister lingered. As the officer made his way back toward the family, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air, no one could predict what would happen next. The neighbor's words still echoed in the officer's mind, and despite all the confusion, he knew one thing: there was a truth buried deep within this story, a truth that had yet to come to light. And when it did, the consequences could be far more serious than anyone had anticipated. The family, now faced with the full weight of the officer's investigation, tried to stay composed, even though their hearts raced with anxiety. What were the police thinking? Were they going to believe the neighbor's version of events, or were they finally starting to see through the facade? And as the minutes turned into hours, one thing became painfully clear: this story wasn't going to end easily. The truth, whatever it was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. But for now, the family would have to sit with the uncomfortable knowledge that the truth was slipping further and further out of reach, leaving only more questions in its wake. What would the morning bring? Would the police come to understand the full scope of the situation, or would they fall for the neighbor's version of events? The suspense continued to mount, and with each passing moment, the family's world seemed to grow smaller and smaller. The end of the story felt as far away as ever, with no answers in sight. This wasn't just a case of an angry neighbor or a simple misunderstanding. Something bigger was at play. But for now, the family could only wait and wonder. As the officer stepped back toward the family's house, his thoughts were racing. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. The neighbor's story didn't quite add up, but he was still unsure. There were gaps in their version of events, little inconsistencies that made him doubt the truth of what he had been told. Yet, the family seemed just as confused and shaken, like they didn't know why they were being dragged into this. The weight of it all felt suffocating, and as he approached the family once again, he knew that this wasn't going to be an easy resolution. The family stood together, trying to hold it together. The tension in the air was palpable, and no one seemed to know what to say. They could feel the eyes of the officers on them, watching, waiting for something. Each one of them was lost in their own thoughts, trying to make sense of what was happening, but all their minds kept circling back to the same question: why? What could they have done to provoke a neighbor they barely knew? Why would someone want to do this to them? As the officer stood before them, his eyes scanning each of their faces, it was clear he was searching for a crack in their story, some indication that they were hiding something. But all he found was uncertainty. The family had no answers for him. No answers that made sense, anyway. It wasn't like they had been involved in anything illegal or dangerous. They were just a normal family trying to get by, just like everyone else on the block. So why had their quiet evening been disrupted in such a drastic way? The officer spoke again, his voice more authoritative now. I need to know exactly what happened here tonight. Was there any reason for this to escalate the way it did? The words felt like a slap. Escalate? It had barely begun. The family could barely process what had happened, let alone try to explain it. There was no reason for this. No reason for the neighbor to have made that call, no reason for the police to be standing there questioning them. The frustration was building inside them, a boiling pot ready to spill over. "We told you already," one of them finally said, their voice shaking with anger now. "We didn't do anything. We were just sitting in the house, minding our business. We didn't ask for this." The officer nodded slowly, his face impassive. But there was a glimmer of doubt in his eyes, as if he wasn't quite convinced. He seemed to be weighing something he wasn't sharing. The longer the conversation dragged on, the more the family felt like they were being scrutinized for something they couldn't even understand. The quiet, peaceful life they had always taken for granted suddenly felt like a fragile thing, something that could be shattered by the smallest of provocations. It was at that moment that the phone rang. The officer glanced down at it, his expression flickering briefly. He excused himself and answered, stepping away from the family for a moment. But his tone shifted as he spoke, and whatever he was hearing on the other end made his jaw tighten. The family couldn't hear the conversation, but they could tell something had changed in him. Whatever he had just learned didn't sit well with him. When the officer returned, his demeanor had shifted. His voice was colder now, more distant. "We need to talk to your neighbor again," he said, his tone flat. It was clear that something had happened during that call. The air between them had thickened, and the suspicion that had been brewing earlier now felt like an undeniable truth. As the officer walked back toward the neighbor's house, the family was left standing there, their minds spinning. They had hoped the worst was over, but now they were beginning to realize that it was just beginning. The unanswered questions weighed on them, the mystery deepening with each passing second. What had the officer learned that had changed his attitude? What had they missed? How could everything feel so wrong when they had done nothing? Inside the neighbor's house, things were far from calm. The officer's second visit wasn't just about gathering more information, it was becoming clear that there was something more serious going on. As the door was opened, the officer was met with a tense silence. The neighbor's eyes flickered with something dangerous, something more than simple concern. It wasn't just a case of misunderstanding anymore, there was a deeper hostility at play, something the officer had been reluctant to see until now. "Why don't you tell me exactly what you saw?" the officer asked, his voice hard, demanding answers. The neighbor didn't flinch. Instead, they stepped back into their house, almost as if inviting the officer to follow. It was as if they were daring him to challenge them, to question the truth of what they had seen. The officer hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, the doors swinging shut behind him. The room felt smaller now, more oppressive, as if the walls were closing in on him. The neighbor, now calm and composed, began to speak again. Their words were careful, calculated, painting a picture of a family that was not just innocent but a threat. They spoke of things that seemed irrelevant, small details that had somehow become twisted into something darker. The officer listened, his brow furrowing. The story seemed rehearsed, almost too perfect. But what unsettled him most was the intensity with which the neighbors spoke. It wasn't just fear in their voice, it was something else. Something deeper. Anger? Resentment? Perhaps even something more personal. As the officer continued to listen, something started to click into place. The neighbor wasn't just telling a story, they were creating one. They weren't simply recounting events, they were shaping a narrative, one that painted the family as the villain. But why? What did they stand to gain from this? And why now? The officer's mind raced, trying to put all the pieces together. Back at the family's house, the atmosphere was thick with anxiety. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. They were still waiting for answers, but none were coming. No explanation. No apology. Only silence. And that silence, more than anything, made them feel exposed. Like they were on trial for something they didn't even understand. Time seemed to drag on, and with it, their nerves frayed. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden from them, some key detail that would explain everything. But for now, it remained just out of reach, like a shadow lurking in the background, always there, but never fully visible. They could only wait, trapped in the uncertainty, knowing that something was about to come crashing down, but not knowing exactly what. In that moment, the officer returned. He said nothing at first, simply glancing at the family with a solemn expression. The family held their breath, waiting for him to speak, but when he finally did, his words cut through the silence like a knife. "It's not over," he said, his voice low, and for the first time that night, the family felt a chill run down their spines. The officer's words hung in the air like a dark cloud, heavy and suffocating. "It's not over." He said it with a finality that made the family's hearts drop. They had hoped that after all the questions, the confusion, the tension, they might finally get some answers, some sense of closure. But instead, they were left with more questions than ever. The officer's cold tone suggested there was something more to this than anyone had realized. He turned to leave again, his silhouette framed in the doorway, casting a long shadow across the room. The family stood frozen, staring at his retreating figure, the weight of his words settling into the pit of their stomachs. The door clicked shut behind him with an eerie finality, and the family was left alone, surrounded by silence that felt oppressive, almost suffocating. Each of them could feel the tension rising like something was about to snap, but no one knew when or how. The neighbors' accusations, the police presence, everything had escalated so quickly, and now it felt like they were standing at the edge of something dangerous. No one knew where this was heading, but they all felt it, the unsettling realization that the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. Minutes dragged by in agonizing silence. The family members were restless, pacing, barely able to sit still as the anticipation built. What was happening? Why were they being pulled into this web of suspicion and fear? The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder and louder, a constant reminder of time slipping away, of everything spinning out of control. The officer hadn't come back yet. Was he investigating the neighbors' claims more thoroughly? Was he trying to gather evidence? The thought of their lives being torn apart over a false accusation made their heads spin. Every scenario they imagined only made the situation feel more and more surreal. Why hadn't the officer seen through the neighbor's fabricated story? Why was it still going on? And then, just as the last shred of hope seemed to flicker out, the sound of tires screeching outside broke the silence. The family rushed to the window, their hearts pounding in their chests. Another patrol car had pulled up in front of their house, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a warning. The officer from earlier stepped out, but this time he was not alone. A second officer followed, and behind them was a figure the family didn't recognize. They couldn't see the person clearly from the window, but the silhouette of a stranger standing in their front yard, flanked by two officers, made their blood run cold. The doorbell rang, shattering the stillness. Every muscle in the family's body tensed. What now? The officer's earlier words echoed in their minds, the chill of his tone still fresh. They opened the door, and there stood the officer, flanked by the two others. One officer was holding a clipboard, his face unreadable, while the other officer stood slightly behind, his hands resting on his belt, eyes scanning the family with a cold detachment. The stranger in the background was still out of sight, but the officer's eyes flickered toward them. A subtle but unmistakable signal. This wasn't just another check-in. This was something bigger, something far more serious. "We need to talk," the officer said, his voice firm, almost apologetic. The family stood frozen, too stunned to speak. What was happening? They had done everything they were supposed to do. They had tried to cooperate, to explain the situation. So why did it feel like they were being dragged deeper into a nightmare? "What is this about?" one of the family members managed to say, their voice strained, their words hanging in the air like an accusation. The officer's gaze remained steady. "We need your cooperation. We've received new information, and we need to follow up." New information? The family felt the ground beneath them shift. They could feel it then, the weight of the situation, the heaviness in the air. Something had changed, but they still had no idea what it was. The officer motioned for them to step aside as the two other officers moved in, their expressions unreadable. One of the officers, clipboard in hand, began reading aloud from a list of statements, questions about their whereabouts earlier that day, their interactions with the neighbor. Each question felt like another needle piercing their calm, unraveling their peace of mind. The questions grew more intense, and with each one, the family began to feel like they were being pushed further into a corner. They answered as best as they could, but it felt like the officer was looking for something more, something they hadn't said yet, some hidden detail that would give them the key to the mystery. The air was thick with the tension of unspoken words, the weight of this situation bearing down on them with every passing second. Their eyes kept darting to the figure standing in the yard, still out of view, as if they were waiting for something to happen. What was the officer hiding? What were they about to reveal? The unknown was more terrifying than anything the family could have imagined. Just as the situation seemed to be escalating to a breaking point, the officer's phone buzzed, a sharp noise that cut through the tension. He glanced down at it quickly, his expression changing for the briefest moment. Then he turned back to the family, his voice low and steady. "You need to come with us," he said, and for the first time that night, there was no room for negotiation in his voice. The family's hearts raced, their breath catching in their throats. This wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a request. The officer wasn't asking anymore. The stranger in the yard, who had remained a shadow for so long, suddenly stepped forward, coming into view for the first time. They were wearing a suit, their face hidden behind dark sunglasses, a figure who seemed too out of place in the quiet neighborhood. It was hard to read their expression, but there was an unmistakable air of authority about them, an aura of someone who was used to being obeyed. The family's confusion turned to alarm. This was no longer just a misunderstanding. The stakes had been raised. Whatever this was, it was bigger than them, bigger than the neighborhood, bigger than anything they had ever imagined. "Is this really necessary?" one of them asked, their voice shaking. The officer didn't answer right away, but his silence spoke volumes. The stranger's steps were measured as they moved toward the door. The family hesitated for a moment, their minds spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the officer's presence, the silent demand in their gaze, was too much to ignore. They had no choice but to comply. As the door closed behind them, locking them out of their home, the final pieces of the puzzle seemed to be falling into place, just not in the way they had hoped. The family felt like they were being swept along by a current, pulled into something much larger than they could control. They had no idea what was coming next, but they could feel it. The storm was gathering, and the consequences of whatever lay ahead were becoming more and more real. The officers, the stranger, the call, everything was pointing to something that was about to explode. The family walked with them in silence, each step taking them further into the unknown, the tension building higher with every second. The end was coming, but they had no idea what it would look like or how it would change everything. As they stepped into the patrol car, the family's hearts raced, their minds scrambling to understand the whirlwind of events that had unfolded in just a few hours. The officers didn't say a word as they drove down the darkened streets, the low hum of the engine the only sound filling the air. The family was tightly packed together in the back seat, each person clinging to their thoughts, their eyes darting nervously to the windows, as if expecting something to jump out from the shadows. Every turn felt like it was taking them further from safety, further from the place they once called home. They tried to make sense of the situation, but the more they thought about it, the less it made sense. Why had the officer been so insistent that they leave their home? What was the stranger really here for, and why had they been so secretive? They couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was happening, a hidden agenda they weren't privy to. It felt like they were being pulled into a web of intrigue, and the tighter it got, the less they could see the way out. The patrol car slowed as it approached an unfamiliar building, a large, nondescript structure that loomed like a fortress in the darkness. The kind of place that shouldn't exist in their quiet neighborhood. The family exchanged wary glances, but no one spoke. The officers didn't acknowledge them as they parked, their movements swift and purposeful. The stranger from the yard was already out of the car, their expression unreadable. With a subtle wave, they motioned for the family to follow. The building before them seemed to swallow the light. It was almost as though the world outside had faded into nothingness. The family hesitated, but the cold, unyielding presence of the officers pushed them forward. There was no choice now but to follow, even as doubt and fear gnawed at their insides. This was it. The moment when everything would change. But change into what? As they stepped through the heavy metal doors, the air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. The walls were bare, almost sterile, with flickering overhead lights casting long shadows across the hall. The sterile environment felt suffocating. It was so stark, so devoid of warmth, that it felt like a place where secrets were kept, secrets that were meant to stay hidden. "Sit," the officer said, his voice flat, as he motioned to a row of chairs in the center of a small, dimly lit room. The family sat down together, exchanging nervous glances, unsure of what to expect next. The stranger stood at the far end of the room, speaking into a phone in low, measured tones, their back to the family. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, the quiet before a storm. Each second stretched out like an eternity, but the family knew that something was coming. Something that could change everything. The stranger's conversation ended abruptly. They turned slowly, their eyes scanning the family with an intensity that made their skin crawl. "You don't know why you're here, do you?" they asked, their voice sharp, as if daring the family to answer. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, no one spoke. They didn't know. They couldn't know. The officer stepped forward, breaking the silence. "The situation has changed," he said, his tone betraying no emotion. "We need to investigate further." He wasn't speaking to the family. He wasn't speaking to the stranger. His words seemed to hang between them, like a message no one wanted to hear. Then, with a suddenness that took them by surprise, the stranger pulled something from their coat, a small device, sleek and black, almost like a piece of high-tech equipment. The family's eyes widened as the stranger pressed a button, and the device emitted a soft, ominous hum. The sound seemed to vibrate in the air, sending a chill down their spines. "I've been watching," the stranger said, their voice cold, calculating. "For months now." The family's heart stopped. Watching? For months? What was this person talking about? The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in. Each breath seemed harder to take. Their minds raced, trying to connect the dots. They were just ordinary people. What could they have possibly done to warrant this kind of surveillance? This kind of attention? The stranger smiled, though it didn't reach their eyes. "You think this is about a neighbor, don't you? About some trivial dispute?" They paused, letting the words hang in the air, before continuing. "This is much bigger than that." The room went deathly silent. The family couldn't process what they were hearing. Bigger than a neighbor? What could be bigger than that? They had no enemies. No secrets. They were just a family, trying to live their lives. What could possibly tie them to something so dangerous? The stranger continued, their eyes never leaving the family. "This has been in motion for a long time. Your lives were never truly your own. Every step you've taken, every move you've made, we've known. We've been waiting for the right moment to bring you in. And now it's time." The words hit them like a physical blow. The family sat frozen, the reality of the situation slowly sinking in, like cold water filling a glass. What was happening? Why were they being dragged into something that didn't make sense? How had their quiet lives become entangled in something so dark and twisted? The officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the stranger, but the stranger didn't acknowledge him. Their focus remained solely on the family. It was clear they were in control here. They had orchestrated every move, every moment leading up to this. The officer, the neighbor, the accusations, none of it was what it seemed. Do you understand now? The stranger asked, leaning forward. This isn't about a mistake or a misunderstanding. This is about power. Control. And you've been a part of it all along, whether you realize it or not. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The family was barely able to breathe. The tension in the room was unbearable, and the silence that followed was worse than any sound. No one knew how to respond, what to say. They had no idea what was happening, why they were here, or what the stranger wanted from them. The officer remained silent, his role in this situation unclear. He had been the one to bring the family here, to drag them into this strange web of secrets and lies, but now he seemed like just another pawn in the game. The strangers straightened, their voice low but clear. It's time for you to choose. Your lives, your future, they can be whatever you want them to be. But only if you make the right decision. The family was paralyzed, their minds spinning, trying to make sense of the impossible situation they found themselves in. Every part of them screamed that they needed to get out, that they needed answers, but they knew deep down that they were trapped now. The stakes had never been higher, and the clock was ticking down to a moment of reckoning. As the stranger turned toward the officer, the family knew that whatever came next would be the beginning of something they couldn't undo. The uncertainty, the fear, it all coalesced into one question: what would happen when the truth finally came to light? The air in the small, dimly lit room felt thick, like it was holding its breath, and the tension was so heavy that the family could hardly think straight. The stranger's words echoed in their minds, replaying over and over again. Power. Control. You've been a part of it all along. Every time they tried to make sense of it, their minds went in circles. What had they done to deserve this? They were just a family, living their lives, minding their own business. They couldn't wrap their heads around the gravity of what was happening. The officer remained silent, standing off to the side, a mere shadow in the room. He seemed like an unwilling participant, someone caught up in something much larger than he had anticipated. The family's eyes flicked toward him, seeking some sign of reassurance, but he didn't meet their gaze. Instead, his eyes were fixed on the stranger, whose calm demeanor only made everything more unsettling. The stranger was waiting for a response. They knew they held the power in this room. They were the one pulling the strings, orchestrating every move. The family felt cornered, trapped in a nightmare they never saw coming. They had no choice but to react, but the question was, how? How could they possibly make the right decision when they didn't even understand what was at stake? With a deep breath, one of them spoke, their voice barely above a whisper. What do you want from us? It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of everything they had been through so far. It was the only question that mattered. The stranger's lips curled into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. I want you to understand what's really happening here, they said, their voice smooth, calculated. You've been part of something much bigger than yourself. And now, I'm giving you the chance to step into a world where your role can change. You can make a difference. The family exchanged confused glances. What does that even mean? Another one asked, their voice shaking. They had no idea what the stranger was talking about. All they had wanted was to live in peace, but it seemed like they had stumbled into something they were never meant to understand. The stranger's smile faded, and they took a step closer. You're in a position of power, whether you realize it or not. Every move you make can change the course of things. You're being tested, but this test is not just for you. It's for the world around you. There's more at play here than just your neighborhood, than just your neighbor's accusations. The words hit them like a wave, crashing over them in a rush. The reality of the situation was beginning to settle in, but it still didn't make sense. How could they be part of something so much bigger? They were just ordinary people, living an ordinary life. What was this stranger talking about? Who are you? One of them finally managed to ask, their voice strained. They needed answers, needed something to hold on to. The stranger's gaze hardened, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something deeper in their eyes. Something that almost resembled pity. You'll find out soon enough, they said, their voice dropping to a whisper. But for now, you need to decide. Do you want to continue living as you have, in the dark? Or do you want to take control of your future? The room was silent for a long moment as the family absorbed the weight of the question. They were being offered a choice, but it wasn't a simple one. Could they really take control of something they didn't even understand? Was it worth the risk? What would their lives look like if they chose to step into this unknown world? Before anyone could speak, the officer finally moved, his voice low and almost apologetic. I never wanted any of this. But I was forced into this position too. You're not the only ones being tested. His words hung in the air, carrying a sense of remorse, as though he too had been a pawn in a much larger game. The family turned their attention back to the stranger, who had remained eerily calm throughout the exchange. The stranger seemed to be weighing their response, studying them carefully as if their next words would determine everything. This is your moment, they said. The choice is yours. You can walk away, continue with your lives, but you'll never know the truth. Or you can join me. And together, we can make something bigger than you ever imagined. The family's hearts pounded in their chests as they processed everything. The idea of turning their backs on this, of walking away and pretending like none of this had ever happened, was tempting. But at the same time, the pull of something greater, something mysterious, something that promised power and understanding, was too strong to ignore. Finally, one of them stood up. We want to know the truth, they said, their voice steady, despite the chaos inside. We want to understand what's really going on here. The stranger's eyes gleamed with approval, as though they had been expecting this answer all along. Good, they said, their voice low and commanding. Then prepare yourselves. The journey ahead will change everything. The officer, still standing to the side, nodded slightly, his face a mask of resignation. It was clear that he, too, had accepted the path they were on, though his reasons remained unclear. The stranger led them out of the room, their footsteps echoing through the cold, sterile halls. As they walked, the family felt the weight of their decision settle over them. They had chosen a path that led into the unknown, and there was no turning back. What had begun as a simple dispute with a neighbor had evolved into something far more complex, and their lives would never be the same. When they finally reached the door, the stranger paused, turning to face them one last time. Are you ready for the truth? They asked, their voice barely above a whisper. The family nodded, their minds swirling with anticipation, dread, and uncertainty. They didn't know what lay ahead, but they knew one thing for sure: the truth was more complicated, more dangerous, and more powerful than they could have ever imagined. With that, the door opened, and the family stepped out into the night, into a world that had suddenly become much larger than they ever thought possible. As they walked into the unknown, they couldn't help but wonder, what kind of world had they just entered, and how far would they be willing to go to uncover the truth? The streets outside were eerily quiet, the hum of the city in the distance, but for the family, everything felt different. The stakes were higher now. They had crossed a line, and they were no longer the same people who had walked into that building hours ago. They were part of something bigger. something much bigger than they ever could have imagined. And as the night swallowed them up, they knew that their journey had only just begun. They had made their choice, and now they would face the consequences. But whatever came next, they knew one thing: they would never be the same again.